All right, so you're gearing up for that deep dive into stability operations, and let's face it, ADP 307, not exactly a page turner. But hey, that's why we're here. We're tackling Chapter 4 head on, digging out those nuggets of wisdom that'll make you shine in training. Think of this as your secret weapon to sounding brilliant, throwing in real world examples, and maybe even a few war stories to keep things lively.
It's really something how much ADP 307 hammers home planning. It's that reminder that stability ops, they're not about just reacting to the chaos, it's about shaping the peace.
Like that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Except in this case, that ounce involves a ton of planning and really grasping the playing field.
You got it. And this chapter, it really drives home that planning for stability, it isn't a one and done deal. It's a cycle, always evolving. Remember that roundabout we talked about?
Hmm.
It's like that you're constantly circling back, reassessing, adapting on the fly based on what's happening on the ground.
Makes sense. I mean, how often have we seen things go sideways because someone was stuck on plan A when the situation was screaming for plan B or even plan C?
Way too many times, that's for sure. And that's where getting those different planning horizons becomes crucial, right? You've got to balance those short-term needs, things like immediate security, basic necessities with the long game, fostering good governance, economic development, building that lasting peace. It's a delicate dance, that's for sure.
Okay, so for example, what happens when you go all in on those short term needs, but those long term goals? They fall by the wayside.
Okay, picture this. You're in a region, slammed by drought, the economy is on its last legs. Tempting to just truck in bottled water, right? Problem solved, at least for the moment.
Sure, but then what happens when those trucks stop rolling? You haven't really fixed the root cause.
Exactly. You might have even made it worse. Flood the market with free water. What happens to those local businesses trying to make a living selling water? They're gone. Now you've got a whole new set of problems to deal with.
So it's about finding those solutions that stick, that empower those communities to thrive on their own terms, not just slapping on those temporary fixes.
You nailed it. And that long-term perspective, it's woven throughout this entire chapter, especially when we're talking about the commander's role in all of this.
Okay, so let's talk command. What does ADP 307 say about leadership in a stability environment?
It highlights three big things for any commander: understanding, visualizing, and describing. And trust me, these aren't just buzzwords they throw around. They're key to everyone being on the same page about what success actually looks like. Because in stability ops,
Yeah.
that can be surprisingly subjective.
Okay, so break it down for me. Let's start with understanding. Seems pretty straightforward, but something tells me there's more to it.
You're right, it's way more than just skimming intel reports. It's about getting those nuances of the environment. It's not just knowing where the enemy is. It's understanding the culture, the politics, the tensions, those human factors that drive instability in the first place.
And that's where our civil affairs teams, they really prove their worth, right?
100%. Their expertise is golden. They're trained to bridge that gap between the military and the civilian world to gather those insights you won't find on any map. Boots on the ground, engaging with the locals, really listening to their concerns.
Because sometimes the most valuable intel comes from a conversation, not a drone feed, right?
Absolutely. Those personal connections, building that trust, that's what gives a commander that real understanding.
Okay, so you've got a handle on the situation, the good, the bad, the downright ugly. Now you have to visualize. What's the end game here?
Now, this is where it gets interesting, visualizing here. It isn't about racking up enemy KIAs or capturing territory. It's about painting a picture of what success means for the people who live there.
So what does that look like? Give me a visual.
Imagine a bustling marketplace, not deserted streets, kids heading to school, not hiding in bunkers, a functioning local government, not a power vacuum. It's about envisioning that future where those everyday rhythms of life, they've returned, even while they're rebuilding.
So more than restoring order, it's creating that sense of normalcy, that belief that a better future is possible.
Exactly. And once you've got that vision locked in, you need everyone else to see it too. That's where describing comes in.
Right. A vision's only as good as its execution.
100%. Describing is about clarity, taking that mental picture and turning it into action. The commander has to articulate their intent, that desired end state, in a way that leaves no room for guesswork.
It's about making sure everyone from the top brass down to the boots on the ground is on the same page.
Exactly. Because even with the best intentions, a poorly communicated plan is a recipe for confusion and chaos.
And in stability operations, clarity equals stability. So we've got the groundwork, understanding, visualizing, describing. Now let's talk operational art. What are those core principles that really come into play when we're talking stability?
Now remember, all those elements of operational art are important, but they take on a whole new meaning when it comes to stability. Let's start with end states and conditions.
Okay, so in a traditional fight, your end state might be defeat the enemy, secure this territory. But stability, that's a whole different ballgame.
You said it. In a stability environment, success isn't always about clear-cut victory. It's about creating those conditions, those environments where peace can take root and grow.
So, what's that look like on the ground? How do you measure success when there's no enemy to crush, no hill to take?
Think of it less like a decisive battle, more like a complex ecosystem slowly coming back to life. Are those local security forces handling their own security? Is the local government working? Are people able to get basic services, rebuild their lives, have hope for the future? Those are your markers of success in stability ops.
It's about making peace and stability self-sustaining, to where your presence isn't needed anymore.
You got it. And that takes a much more nuanced approach, one that blends those military efforts with diplomatic initiatives, economic development, humanitarian aid.
It's that whole of government approach we always hear about, but rarely see done well.
You're telling me. And that complexity makes nailing down those clear, achievable end states even harder. It's not as simple as we will defeat this enemy by this date.
You're talking about changing behavior, rebuilding institutions, healing those deep-seated divisions. That takes time, patience, understanding those local dynamics.
Absolutely. It's a long game. You're planting those seeds of peace today that might not fully bloom for years, even decades.
It's about laying the foundation for future generations to build on. Now, what about those decisive points? In a conventional fight, it's all about seizing key terrain. How does that work in a stability environment?
That's the million-dollar question. It gets to the heart of why stability ops require a different kind of thinking. Those decisive points, they're not always physical locations anymore. It's about identifying those pivotal events, those make-or-break moments that can tip the scales towards stability or send everything crashing down.
Give me an example. What's a decisive point look like in a stability operation?
Imagine you're helping a nation rebuild after a brutal civil war. Successfully holding those first democratic elections, that could be a decisive point. It's not about capturing a hilltop. It's about achieving a political outcome that gives people hope.
It's about those moments that capture the imagination, show progress, build momentum towards a better future.
Exactly. Or think about something as simple as repairing a power grid, a water treatment plant, that bridge connecting a rural community to the capital.
So those aren't just logistical tasks, they're symbolic victories impacting how the entire population sees security and normalcy.
Exactly. And those ripple effects are what we're going for in stability operations. It's those small victories that, over time, add up to big and lasting change.
I'm starting to see how these concepts, they take on a whole new meaning when you're talking about stability. So we've got our end states, our decisive points. What about those lines of effort? How do you connect the dots between those day-to-day tasks and that bigger strategic vision, especially when you're dealing with things like building trust or fostering economic development?
You're right, it's not as simple as drawing a line on a map from point A to point B. Lines of effort in stability operations often represent those less tangible but equally important goals. Those things that are harder to quantify, but essential for creating a lasting peace.
So how do you define those lines of effort when you're dealing with those more abstract goals? Give me an example.
Let's say your main goal is to reestablish trust in the local government.
Hmm.
Your lines of effort might be things like training local officials in good governance, improving transparency and accountability within those government institutions, and creating those platforms for citizen engagement, feedback, that kind of thing.
So you're weaving together different strands of effort into a cohesive whole. Each line's distinct, but they're all working towards that bigger goal of a stable and resilient society.
You got it. Those lines of effort help commanders visualize those connections, ensure those resources are used effectively, and that everyone gets how their individual actions contribute to that bigger picture.
It's about showing those soldiers that even those seemingly small tasks, maybe helping farmers get their crops to market or rebuilding a schoolhouse, they play a vital role in building that lasting peace.
Exactly. Connecting those dots between those tactical actions and the strategic objectives.
Okay, so we've got those end states, decisive points, and lines of effort down. Now let's talk about that operational approach. What's the recipe for success in stability operations?
That's the real head-scratcher, because there's no one-size-fits-all. But ADP 307 makes it clear that the best strategies find that balance between two things that seem contradictory. stability mechanisms and defeat mechanisms.
So it's not just about winning hearts and minds. Sometimes you have to be ready to fight.
Exactly. It's striking that balance between strength and a helping hand. Recognizing that in these situations, you need to be both the warrior and the diplomat, sometimes in the same day, even the same hour.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's break those down, those stability and defeat mechanisms. What are we talking about here?
So when we talk stability mechanisms, ADP 307 lays out 4 big ones: compel, control, influence, and support.
All right, let's break them down. Compel. That sounds like a fancy word for show of force.
It can be, but it's more nuanced than that.
Hmm.
Compel is about presence, showing you've got the muscle and the will to use force if you absolutely have to keep order, protect civilians. But it's got to be strategic, proportional. Every bullet, every show of force, it echoes through the whole mission.
Because nothing breaks trust faster than seeming like you're trigger happy.
Exactly. It's finding that sweet spot you're a force to be reckoned with, but one that operates with restraint, respect for the law, always aiming to make that force unnecessary.
Deterrence, not domination.
You got it. Now, control, that's about establishing that security, that order, often right after a conflict or when things are really unstable. About setting the stage for those long-term efforts to take hold.
So if compel is like, don't even think about it, control is creating the breathing room.
Think of those first days after a major conflict. Chaos, uncertainty. Control might be securing key infrastructure, disarming militias, enforcing curfews, those visible signs that order is returning.
Giving people that space to even start rebuilding?
But remember, control isn't about forcing our will on them. It's about working with those local partners, getting that legitimate authority back in place, helping them govern themselves. Not an occupying force, a stabilizing one.
Got it. So we've got compel and control. What about influence? This feels like where the whole hearts and minds thing comes into play.
100%. Influence is about shaping perceptions, influencing behavior. Think strategic communication, info ops, but also building those relationships with local leaders, showing through your actions that you're a reliable partner.
So more than just winning battles, it's winning over the population.
Exactly. And that takes a deep understanding of the culture, being able to communicate effectively, but most importantly, genuinely ethical and transparent behavior. Remember, actions speak louder than words. If you're not living up to your own values, no amount of slick talking is going to win people over.
It's that trust, that credibility, showing you're there for the right reasons.
Okay, so we've got compel, control, influence. What a support?
Support is all about getting that host nation to stand on its own 2 feet again. Could be providing humanitarian assistance, helping rebuild infrastructure, training local security forces, supporting the development of democratic institutions, the whole 9 yards.
So setting them up for success, not just a quick fix.
Think of it like this. You're not just building a house, you're teaching them how to build their own house, then giving them the tools and materials they need.
Empowering them to take charge of their own future.
Now, these 4 stability mechanisms, they're powerful. But ADP 307 reminds us sometimes you can't reason with a threat. That's where those defeat mechanisms come in. Right, because stability operations, it's not about ignoring those who threaten the peace. It's knowing when to use that military power.
But here's the key difference. In stability operations, using those defeat mechanisms, destroy, dislocate, disintegrate, isolate, it's got to be carefully considered. Not all-out war, but using those tools wisely, proportionately, always with an eye on creating those conditions for stability.
So you might need to take down a warlord who's terrorizing civilians, but you've got to be mindful of casualties, avoiding damage to infrastructure.
Finding that balance enough force to neutralize the threat, but not so much that you create more instability, undermine those long-term goals.
A tough needle to thread for sure, especially when the line between war and peace is so blurry.
You got it. And that's why ADP 307 stresses understanding not just those individual mechanisms, but how to use them together, tailoring the approach to the specific situation.
So for example, how would a commander blend those stability and defeat mechanisms in the real world?
Say you're operating in a region, trying to recover from a long insurgency. Still got armed groups out there hitting civilians, undermining the government.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Now you could try to wipe out those groups with a huge military campaign.
But that could backfire, alienating the population, breathing new life into that insurgency.
Bingo. It's about understanding that sometimes the best way to beat an enemy is to give them a way out. A more nuanced approach might involve a mix of strategies. You might use your presence, that compel mechanism, to keep those armed groups in check while you're launching a disarmament program, helping them reintegrate into society.
So offering those fighters a way to lay down their arms, maybe learn a trade, blending compel, control, and support.
And all of that backed up by a solid information operations campaign that influence to counter the propaganda, address those root causes, build support for peace.
Because in the end, you can't force lasting stability at gunpoint. It has to come from within.
Absolutely. And that takes changing hearts and minds, building trust, creating that shared vision for a better future.
It's a long road, but it sounds like ADP 307 provides that roadmap.
It's about understanding that stability operations are just as much about those social and political dynamics as those military ones.
And remembering you're not just fighting an enemy, you're trying to rebuild a nation.
And that takes a whole different set of tools, a whole different mindset.
ADP 307 also talks about constantly reassessing, adapting your approach, no sticking to a rigid plan. The situation on the ground, it's always in flux.
Adaptability is key in stability operations,
Yeah.
maybe more so than in any other military operation. What works today might not work tomorrow. You have to read the room, anticipate those shifts, adjust your course.
Just so flexible, stay agile, don't get married to the plan.
It's about constantly reevaluating, making sure your actions are still hitting those objectives, being willing to change course if they're not. And that takes communication, collaboration, not just within the military, but with those interagency partners, NGOs, local actors.
It's about breaking down those walls, building those relationships.
Because in stability operations, your strength comes from those partnerships you make. And speaking of partnerships, ADP 307 zeroes in on legitimacy.
Legitimacy, right. Being seen as a credible and trustworthy partner by those local communities. It's a big deal in the doctrine.
And for good reason. Legitimacy is your currency in this line of work. It's the foundation for trust, cooperation, buy-in from the people you're there to help. Without it, you're just another armed group, and your efforts to build peace, they're going nowhere.
Okay, so how do you build legitimacy? It's not like you can just roll in with a PowerPoint and call it a day.
You got that right. Building legitimacy is about consistent action, transparency, a real commitment to the well-being of those communities, showing them day in and day out that you're not there to conquer, but to help them rebuild on their own terms.
So give me some examples. How do military forces build that legitimacy in a stability environment?
One of the most powerful ways is how you treat civilians. Every interaction, whether it's a checkpoint, a patrol, or a humanitarian aid distribution, it's a chance to build trust or break it. Treating people with dignity and respect, even when things are tense, it goes a long way.
Every interaction, every encounter, it sends a message.
And it's not just about avoiding those negative interactions. It's
No.
about actively looking for opportunities to engage with those communities in a positive way. Supporting local projects, being part of cultural events, showing that you're invested in their community, their culture, their future.
Building those bridges of understanding.
Exactly. Another crucial piece of building legitimacy is making sure your actions are seen as fair and impartial. You can't pick sides, even if it seems like a good idea at the time.
Because those short-term gains can backfire. You're seen as biased, you lose credibility, trust, and you put the whole mission at risk.
It's about being an honest broker, a neutral party there to support peace, uphold the law, make sure everyone has a stake in the future.
That's got to be tough, especially in places with deep-rooted grievances and constantly shifting political landscapes.
You're telling me. It's a constant balancing act. It's one of the things that makes stability operations so challenging, so demanding, and honestly, so rewarding.
Because when you get it right, when those communities start to heal, when you see those institutions taking root, those cycles of violence breaking down, there's nothing like it.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
It's knowing you made a difference in people's lives, that you helped build a more peaceful world for future generations.
Sometimes that's a victory that means even more than winning on the battlefield.
Absolutely. Speaking of victories, ADP 307 also reminds us that in stability operations, those victories are usually gradual, the timelines are long, and setbacks, they're going to happen.
Patience is a virtue, as they say.
More than a virtue, it's essential. Stability operations, they're marathons, not sprints. You need that long-term commitment, that willingness to stay engaged, even when the spotlight's moved on.
And a plan to eventually hand the reins over to those local partners?
You got it. The goal is not to be there forever. It's to create a situation where you're no longer needed.
Giving those communities the power to take control of their own security, their own governance, their own future.
But that takes time, patience, understanding. You can't just drop the mic and walk away. You've got to help them build those institutions, cultivate those leaders, create the conditions for peace to grow on its own.
And that takes a certain mindset, right? Being comfortable with ambiguity, accepting that progress might be slow, and never losing sight of those long-term goals, even when those quick wins seem impossible.
It's about understanding that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that take the longest to achieve.
ADP 307 also talks about working with those non-military groups, NGOs, international organizations, local community groups. Why is that so important?
Because these days, stability operations are almost never a solo mission for the military. It's about building those partnerships, coordinating efforts, using everyone's strengths. Everyone brings something different to the table.
Building those coalitions, those networks, all focused on that same goal of peace.
The military might have logistics, the manpower, but those NGOs, they've often got those deep roots in the community, that local knowledge, those relationships, those specialized skills in things like development or human rights.
Realizing that no one group has all the answers.
And knowing that the most successful missions leverage everyone's wisdom, all those different perspectives, to tackle the root causes of conflict.
So how do you even go about building those partnerships with those non-military groups? It seems like it could get complicated with different organizational cultures, different goals, different ways of working.
It definitely can be. Communication is key, and it's got to start early. Who are the major players? What are their priorities, their limitations? How can we work together to reach our shared goals?
So build those relationships before the crisis hits. Open those lines of communication. Make sure everyone's on the same page.
And it takes a certain humility, recognizing that those civilian groups often have insights into the local situation that even the best military planners might miss.
They've often been working in these communities for years, building those connections, that trust.
They might have their finger on the pulse in a way that outsiders can't match.
So tap into that local knowledge, use those existing networks, and remember that sometimes the best way to learn is to listen.
And be open to different ways of approaching the problem. In these complex situations, there's rarely just one right answer.
Being flexible, adaptable, and willing to admit that we don't always know everything.
Now, another important thing for working in these environments is cultural sensitivity, understanding, respecting, and adapting to different cultural values and beliefs. It sounds simple, but you'd be amazed how often it trips people up.
Right, cultural awareness, it's not just about being politically correct, it's about being effective.
Those cultural missteps, even if you don't mean anything by it, can have serious consequences.
So what might that look like in a stability operation? How could it impact the mission?
Let's say you're trying to negotiate a ceasefire between two groups. You set up a meeting where you accidentally seat the leaders in a way that disrespects their cultural norms about seniority.
You could torpedo the whole thing before it even begins.
Exactly. Or imagine you've got this public information campaign, but the images you're using, maybe even something as small as a hand gesture or a color, it's offensive in that culture.
Good intentions out the window.
Those mistakes can wreck your credibility, damage relationships, even make tensions worse.
So it's not enough to just mean well. You have to do your research, understand those cultural nuances, be willing to adjust how you communicate, how you act.
It's not always easy. We all see things through our own cultural lens, and those lenses can be distorting. We might not even realize it, but we're always filtering information through our own biases.
It's like they say, we judge others by their actions, but ourselves by our intentions.
And those biases can lead to misunderstandings, missed opportunities. That's why cultural awareness training is so important.
It's more than just memorizing a list of rules. It's about developing empathy, being able to see the world through someone else's eyes.
And it's about building a culture of respect and curiosity within the military, where those different viewpoints are valued, where we're encouraged to learn from the communities we work with.
Because at the end of the day, stability operations are about people.
Building relationships, those bridges of understanding, recognizing our shared humanity, even in the middle of chaos.
So we've talked about cultural sensitivity, building those partnerships. What else from ADP 307 can help us wrap our heads around planning for stability?
One thing that really jumps out is this focus on assessment. How do you measure progress in something so complex and often unpredictable? It's a tough one, wouldn't you say?
In a traditional fight, you've got those clear metrics, territory gain, enemy casualties. But stability, it's about changing minds, building institutions, creating the conditions for lasting peace. Those are much harder to put numbers on.
It's not about counting tanks or miles. It's about understanding how the balance of power shifts, how those governance structures improve, whether there are more economic opportunities. It's about those perceptions, those beliefs that shape whether peace is possible.
So how do you even start to measure that? What tools do you use? Where do you even begin?
Well, it's like,
This is tough.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like trying to measure the success of, I don't know, a garden, right? You can
Yeah.
count the seeds, track the rainfall, all that. But at the end of the day, it's those things you can't really put your finger on the soil, how strong the roots are, how well they handle disease. That's what determines if those plants are going to make it.
That's a good way to put it. And it shows why ADP 307 really stresses using both those hard numbers and those more, I don't know, touchy-feely indicators when you're assessing stability.
Yeah, yeah.
So not just crunching the numbers, but actually getting out there, talking to people, getting their perspective right.
Exactly. It's about having those conversations, hearing their stories, understanding what they're up against, what they hope for. Because those stories, they often tell you what the spreadsheets can't.
It's about the human side of those statistics.
100%. And it's about taking those stories, those observations, and putting them alongside the data to get the full picture.
So you need both, the data and the gut feeling.
You got it. It's about recognizing that in these situations, sometimes the most valuable insights come from those unexpected places, those chance encounters.
Keep your ears open, keep your mind open, and be ready to adjust your assessment based on what you're hearing.
Exactly. Because in stability ops, clinging to outdated assumptions can be just as bad as being totally in the dark.
Okay, so flexibility is key for assessments too. What else does ADP 307 have to say about measuring progress in this kind of environment?
One of the biggest takeaways is this. You got to have those clear, measurable goals from the jump. It's like using a compass. If you don't know where you're going, any path looks as good as the next.
And in stability operations, where the landscape is always changing, that clear direction is essential.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You need those well-defined objectives to guide your actions, figure out where your resources go, and see how you're doing. Otherwise, it's easy to get lost, chase those quick wins, lose sight of the bigger picture.
It's about never forgetting that ultimate goal, a stable and self-sufficient society that doesn't need you there anymore.
Right. And that means setting realistic expectations for your own team and your partners and really tracking your progress towards those goals.
Because without those benchmarks, you risk getting off track, wasting resources, and ultimately coming up short.
And that brings us to another crucial point from ADP 307 patients. Stability. It's not a quick fix.
We've talked about it, but it bears repeating. These operations, they run on a different clock.
It's easy to get discouraged when you're not seeing those immediate wins, when things don't go as planned, when it seems like those seeds of peace are taking forever to grow.
It's about resisting those quick fixes, those premature celebrations. It's about understanding that real change, it's often slow, often happening beneath the surface.
You have to play the long game, stay committed even when things are tough, trust that your efforts are building something that will last.
It's about staying the course, weathering those storms, keeping your eyes on the prize.
Well said. And that brings us to another crucial aspect of stability operations, that ADP 307 highlights the ethical side. It's not just about winning, it's about winning the right way.
It's about approaching peace with the same honor and integrity we bring to war.
Exactly. Because in stability operations, the lines can get blurry. What's right, what's necessary, what's ethical.
You're often operating in those gray areas, those tough situations where there's no easy answer.
And that's where your moral compass, those core values you've been trained on, they're absolutely crucial.
So how do you navigate those ethical dilemmas? What guidance does ADP 307 offer?
One of the most important things is making sure everyone in the military is thinking about ethics at every level. It's not just about handing them a rule book. You've got to instill those habits of ethical reasoning, build that instinct for making sound moral judgments.
It's like building those ethical muscles so when the heat is on, they make the right call without even thinking about it.
And that takes more than just lectures. It takes creating a culture of ethical leadership where those values are on display from the top down.
Leading by example.
Exactly. Soldiers need to see their leaders walking the walk, holding themselves and others accountable, and making it clear that ethical concerns are taken seriously.
Because in the end, ethical conduct isn't just about checking boxes, it's about building trust, showing you're legitimate, and proving that your actions are worthy of that uniform.
Well said. And it's those qualities of character, those unwavering ethical principles, that will ultimately decide whether those stability operations succeed. Because in these tough missions, your character is your destiny.
That's a powerful thought. As we wrap up this deep dive into ADP 307, what's that one big takeaway you want our listeners, those future peacemakers, to remember?
The stability operations are about so much more than just military power. They're about understanding, empathy, building trust, and working together. They're about recognizing that every human being has value, even in the middle of chaos and conflict.
It's about bringing your skills, but also your heart to the mission.
It takes a special kind of person, someone with the skills and the heart, that compassion, that integrity, that dedication to our values.
Because those are the people who will truly make a difference in these complex and challenging environments.
They're the peacemakers, the bridge builders, the healers, who will create a more stable, just, and prosperous world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into ADP 307. And to our listeners, thank you for your service, for your commitment to this crucial mission. Remember, you have the power to build peace, one interaction, one community, one nation at a time. Keep learning, keep leading, and keep making a difference.